yesterday evening was went very well. Very good event. I think a lot of good discussions. So thank you everyone who's involved in organising that and making it happen. And I think it's fair to say, as I mentioned beforehand, Renee and I did a joint presentation to PSAB, and I think there was a lot of interest and a lot of discussions flowing from that. And it just underlines the very good and useful relationship between the two boards. So it was great to be able to make that happen. So I think in terms of moving into today, obviously we've got a couple of important discussions coming up. It only seems like yesterday that Eileen was sitting here at the table. Uh, we'll move into the differential reporting item first, and then we need to have there's quite a lot to discuss under other lease type arrangements. So without further ado, Eileen, to you.
Thank you, Chair. And hello, everyone. I know it says navigating IPSAS on the slide here, and I think as many know around the board, this was the original differential reporting project. And so I would say for me as staff going through the work on this item this quarter, it was really helpful and insightful to sort of step back and think about the journey that the IPSASB has been on over the last year in thinking through, the various discussions that were had, the decisions that were made, leading to where we are today. And so I thought it would be good to just do a kind of, quick overview of that journey so far. If the button works. Sorry. Oh, there we go. I think the magic might have happened from the back. Thank you. So the project was originally added to the IPSASB's work program as a result of the mid-period consultation that went out in 2021. And so it was added to our work program in March 2022. And since then, the IPSASB, as well as staff, had been conducting many types of research and scoping activities to ensure that it better understood the challenges, the considerations, as well as the actual public need relating to this issue. And so through those discussions, the board then had a few key decision points in thinking about the research and scoping findings that it had received. And that was really a big component of the reflection that we wanted to also incorporate into the feedback statement as well. Now, as board members will remember, we had two major discussions in both June and September of this year, which has really led us to where we are now with this initiative, where the IPSASB had noted, and majority of members had voted that it would be more appropriate to actually develop practical support material using a strategic partner organization to actually pragmatically and effectively address the public need that the board had identified. And so really the results coming out of that September discussion was that this was no longer a standard setting project and therefore was removed from the work program as reflected in Ross's program and technical director's report. Now, part of the takeaways for staff then was one, to continue working on sourcing a strategic partner organization that could take on this work and ensure that they're executing the vision that the IPSASB had landed on in September, but also to make sure that we put together a robust feedback statement to really capture the complex discussions, considerations that led to this final decision by the IPSASB, because this was an important topic for our constituents around the world. And so what we wanted to do today was just to show you the draft feedback statement that staff have put together and kind of walk through it together page by page, but really focus on collecting those substantive comments. And the reason for that is this feedback statement is not intended to and is not going to capture any new ideas or views. It's really trying to synthesize a lot of those complex discussions we had as a board into a more higher level document that would resonate with constituents and provide a clear narrative about this journey that the IPSASB has been on. And so we just want to make sure that the feedback statement does cover that. Now, if any members do have offline comments, then of course, feel free to send those editorials to staff online and we can make sure to feed that in. Now, in terms of the actual feedback statement, I'll go through a quick overview of each of the sections.
Sorry, Eileen, and just it might be just appropriate to pause there and also to say that this is not a formal board approval document. it's part of our communication effort rather than anything else. But obviously, we do want to make sure that those discussions and if you like, the reasons from the majority of the board that agreed to take this route, that thinking is in there. So that's why there isn't a formal vote. But obviously, we wanted to make sure that the board had the opportunity to comment on this to make sure that we get the thinking out there.
Thank you, Chair. Definitely a great reminder, and apologies for missing that. And so, in terms of kind of timeline, we are hoping to actually finalize and issue this in January of next year, so in the next few weeks. And so, we just want to make sure that we're kind of focusing on timely communication in that respect. So, very quick overview before we go into the page flip. So overall, we've structured the feedback statement to have a few different sections. And I would say the key thing we try to do with any feedback statement issued to capture IPSASB's discussions and various projects is that an effective feedback statement really should be providing a clear narrative about the IPSASB's journey leading to its decisions. And so in this case, the feedback statement should be capturing that high-level summary of how the IPSASB first took on this project, so the brief history, how it tried to understand the exact public needs, so the various scoping activities, research activities, the deliberations of those activities to understand the public need. That then leads into how the IPSASB considered addressing that public need as a standard setter. And so that really is part of the thinking within the remit and then the way forward that the IPSASB had decided upon. And so you see that structured in the feedback statement. Overall, I would say the core part of the statement is about 5 pages, but we obviously needed to make sure it's within the usual structure and the standard structure to provide the right narrative. So page 1 really focuses on the purpose. Page 2 is where we have that brief history about why we brought on the project into our work program. Page 3 and 4, I would say, is the real meat of the feedback statement in the research scoping activities conducted, leading into the page 5, which is addressing the need as a standard setter, and page 6, which is about the intentions and next steps. The last thing I decided to add in, just because it was such a complex discussion over the last few sessions, as well as some feedback we got from the CAG late last year, I thought it'd be good to just also include an appendix with links to the minutes and the papers in case any constituents did want further information. So with that, happy to take any comments that members may have on some of the substantive points within the feedback statement. And again, happy to take any editorial comments offline as well. Thank you. Back to you, Chair.
Thanks, Eileen. I think that was a very helpful summary of the sort of thought that's gone into it and the approach taken. Before we start to walk through, just any sort of general comments from members. Yeah, Todd.
Thanks. I found this a really nice, easy read. It set out the things that I'd expect it to set out. So well done on the feedback statement. Just one thought that I had as I got to the end of it. If I'm a constituent that's really interested in getting some level of differential reporting, how am I going to know what's going on from here? And I wonder whether we need to set something out about our intentions around keeping people informed, because we got feedback that this was really important from a constituent point of view. We're not taking on a standard setting project, and I think they're going to, constituents may really be looking for what is happening as it's happening, and so we might just need to think about that from a communication perspective.
I mean, on a practical basis, maybe that's as simple as actually just that, on the website, we just, kind of keep that updated in terms of progress. I agree with you, Todd. I think that's, Ross.
Let us take that away and think about how we bring that in. I think there's definitely some place on the website. We have to think about if that's makes sense to be in our current project pages, or if we have somewhere in our focus areas where we talk about implementation or other support materials, maybe we can find somewhere there and, put a little blurb down about what we're planning to do. Thanks, Todd.
Eileen.
The only other thing I would add is staff staff have been talking a bit offline about, do we even add in just a general email at the back of it too, that if they want to have, further questions, they could contact us. So we're considering some options, but completely take the point. I think it's more how do we fit it into like the website, because that's usually where we have our standard setting projects. So we'll continue to keep that in mind. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for that, Todd. Okay, so shall we move into the document? And again, this is a session where what we want to get is sort of substantive comments. If there are any pieces of drafting, then Eileen's obviously very happy to take those offline. Talking of offline, we've lost the monitor again at the front. We're back.
Maybe I'll just go back one slide, because then this is where we kind of had that general overview of where we are. So we could flow through it like this if you'd like. Yep.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, maybe Ross, if you don't mind, just sort of walk us through, and then we can pick up comments in that way.
Yeah, so I think if we go to page 9 of the PDF, the first point is purpose of the feedback statement. That's on page 9. Any comments related to that? Not seeing any so far, so I'm going to move us on to the page 10, which is a brief history of the project. Any substantive comments on the history? Going once, twice. Moving on. Page 11, understanding the public need. Discussion of the research and scoping activities. Any significant comments here? So far, so good. Moving us on to 12, reflecting on feedback and understanding of the public need.
Yeah, Andrew.
Just in the table, when we speak about is it conceptually achievable, we say that to develop a differential reporting model wouldn't be consistent with our conceptual framework. I just wondered if we shouldn't clarify that it's because it's an international one that's much larger user base, because I don't want to send a message to constituents who do have a differential reporting framework that says it's not conceptually sound.
Makes sense. Any other comments?
Mike.
So thank you. As Andrew already mentioned the table, just one comment on the third row. I think we have in the first sentence is a very strong statement that we say that approach that there is really no need for an international differential reporting model. I think the statement is a little bit too strong because we reinterpret a need expressed by our constituents. Hence, I would recommend to soften that language of that first sentences, because it could be interpreted as well as a little bit arrogant, let's say. Thank you.
So just for me to clarify, in the third box, right, under does it address the public need, the very first sentence?
Yes, in the third box, it's more about, we could have a statement about address the public need, but not, let's say, have a contradiction to what is expressed by our constituents before.
Makes sense. Thank you.
Donna.
Yeah, I don't know whether at this point we can explicitly identify the public need so that it's very clear what exactly we are addressing.
Eileen?
So in terms of does it address the public need, to include in here more clearly what the public need is?
Yes, if I look at the history, I think the public need has been identified as a capacity in public entities. Whether we can build on that, and then everything else flows from there.
Yeah, I think we can definitely add to it. I think we went back and forth a little bit about how much detail we want to put in there, but I agree it's something we can definitely add back in if it feels like it's missing now. Thank you.
I mean, I think in each of these cases, obviously this is sort of just getting the subtleties right. And what I'd suggest is that, Eileen, if the members concerned who've made comments have got suggestions on how we approach things, then that's helpful, and then we can just tidy that up. Okay.
So if no more comments, moving us on to page 13. Addressing the public need as a standard setter. Excuse me.
Renee.
Yes, thank you. It's only in the last paragraph that we conclude and we articulate what's coming next or what our action plan is. So I find it light, and I was expecting to see probably a bit more articulation of what will be the characteristics of the guide? How will the guide maybe evolve over time? The fact that it will be scalable, the fact that we may start with more of a static version, eventually work into something different, kind of like the journey that we hope we're going to get to. Maybe the development approach, and maybe lastly, I don't know about the timeline, so I don't know if it's the place here, but I was expecting, like, I was left kind of on my appetite here. I was looking for a bit more about what's coming.
I mean, maybe this just is as simple as actually just making the link through to the next section, because in a way it's covered on the next page. So I think that's why, so maybe it's just better to signpost at that stage. Ross? Yeah. Todd?
I did have a similar thought to Renee's when I went through it, but where I suppose I landed was we probably don't know exactly how this is going to shape up right now, so we can't actually say a lot more about it, which is why I raised the point we need to think about our ongoing communication with those constituents that are very interested in what happens here.
And maybe actually, as in all these things, it's a lot easier to actually say that the precise details are yet to be worked up, and therefore, to Todd's point,
So, Todd, the way you're thinking about it is why it's not in there. Because again, it's not in our control. We're looking for a partner to do the work. We have some aspirations. Maybe with the link to the website, and we put some thoughts down there, we're finalizing the supplier brief and having discussions with potential partners, but that's a negotiation. And they may not agree to everything we want in the first cut. It might take time. So I'm a little apprehensive in our feedback statement on our decision, articulating a lot of hopes that we may not be able to deliver because it's beyond what we're going to do. So I like the approach of linking to the website, and then as we get more information, we can continue to build out the website on what we're doing in this.
Eileen?
Yeah, the only thing I'll add, just to provide some comfort to members too, is that all of the feedback and comments that members made for us in September when we reviewed that very general kind of illustration of what it could be, we have kept all that in mind, and it is something that we are considering as we talk to potential partners. So it's not lost per se, but as Ross said, it's not completely in our control. So it's part of, I think, the negotiations and discussions we'll have to try to make sure that those components come in. And then Renee, I know you mentioned even timeline as well, and that I think is very much in the, dependent on who we engage and what their resources are like. But we definitely understand, how vital it is to be timely with this as well.
Okay. So, in just adding that, making, if you like, that forward process clear, then we'll just see if there's anything here. But I think it's part of that telling the story.
So moving us on to, sorry, Patricia.
Okay. Could you include our text that you, Camila, Lucy, and I elaborate? Because I think it's very explained. In the decision, December decision is a short text, but I think better explain our motivation to vote against.
Ross.
We've got that on the footnote. Well, it's a summary of what we said. We don't want to repeat everything we've put in the minutes already. So
Yeah, I
footnote
mean,
2.
to be clear, this is communicating the reasoning of the majority. So we understand and respect the reasons why the views that the three of you that didn't support it have, but it's not a minute or anything like that. It's actually trying to communicate the views of the majority of the board as to what the way forward is. So that's why it's written in that way. It's not an alternative view or anything like that. Okay.
There is a link to the minutes in the back as well.
Yeah.
So
I think that provides the accountability, but it's trying to give the forward look now in terms of having made the decision. This is what's going to happen. So with that, I think we're there in terms of walking through the document. So Eileen, you've got some drafting suggestions, and obviously try and move to finalise as quickly as we can, and also make sure that we've got the forward communication side of things sorted.
Yeah, so just thanks for me. I'll make sure to connect with Mike and Jonah offline just to make sure I get the nuance of the wording right. And if there are editorials at all, please feel free to reach out. We're going to work towards finalization in January and publishing in January.
Yeah, I think that was
you.
also a point that Andrew made as well.
Yes, I have that. I've written it down. Thank you.
Okay, that's good. Well, I think, Todd summarised it well in terms of thank you very much, Eileen, for your work on this. And I think it's best practice as well that, we are communicating in this way. And I think the cover is quite neat, actually.
I think that's a big thanks to Claudia for redirecting me away from the. There were a few compasses that looked like clocks, which was surprising, but anyway, thank you.
Yes, and thank you very much, Claudia, for your input along the way as well. So despite the task force not getting stood up in the end, Claudia still took on the role of task force chair. So thank you very much for that. Okay, so we now move into item 12, other lease type arrangements. Wait for Joao to come to the table. And I must admit, as I was having my coffee, I was reflecting on the fact that I think the very first board meeting that we had when leases featured was actually my first board meeting as chair. That was March 2016. So I'm now completing my 8th year as chair. So I'm not sure I'd class this as an old friend, but it's certainly been in the making quite a long while. But I think we still have some important decisions to make in terms of how we round this off and bring it all back together again, given, we've actually had quite a lot of different public consultations and, the innovative use of the RFI and so on. I'll stop rambling at that point, and perhaps hand over to you, Lynn, as task force chair for reflections at this point before we head into the detailed material.
Thanks, Ian. A couple of things to say. Firstly, obviously, thank you to the task force for the efforts this quarter and to Joao for your excellent support to us. I think to some degree, we struggled with some of the instructions from the last board meeting, particularly around the instruction around making sure that we had dealt with all of the examples in the RFI and in our literature somewhere when we as a task force were looking at IPSASB 43 and yet many of the examples when we analysed them when they came back from the RFI
often the conclusion was, well, we weren't looking at a lease. And so we couldn't weave all of those examples, and we haven't been able to weave all of those examples into the sort of leases project in itself. And I know Joao's got a slide that will sort of demonstrate that about, we had the RFI, what have we managed to put where? So we are, conscious of that, and conscious, I guess, as task force chair of, well, we do need to find a way of communicating effectively for our constituents that gave us feedback and gave us those examples, and what is the most effective way to show where they've ended up, particularly if they're not going to end up in sort of pronouncements around leases. So that might be something for us to think about whether or not there's any value in doing some sort of communication of that in advance of final pronouncements being issued. Because if we're putting examples into other standards, people might not realise that's what we've done unless we tell them that. So that was my first thing I wanted to say. And the second is, you'll see there's a lot of content in these papers. There's a lot of detailed considerations of all of the comments that we have received. We've tried our best with them. It's something that gets very technical and very, very detailed. But really looking forward to the discussion today on that.
Thanks, Lynn. Ross, you just wanted to come in?
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Lynn. It's interesting on the the wider leases project. In our many travels, both Dave and I have picked up a little bit of noise as well around what's going to happen with the remaining issues from the RFI. So acknowledging that we've dealt with them, but are we going to do anything with that? And are we going to do that when we complete the leases project or not? And I do think it would be nice, after an 8-year project, if when we're finished, there aren't any existing issues that people can say we haven't dealt with, given we've had ED 64, ED 75, IPSAS 43, the ED on other lease type arrangements, and the RFI. It kind of feels like a nice way to tidy it up if we would just deal with those additional examples that identified in the RFI, put them into the relevant standards, so that when people come across these issues, they're clear on what to do with them, not just that they're not a lease. So I would propose that we work up a short ED on that from the staff side for the board to look at. And I think we could do that by March. And I believe we could do it on a short consultation, given it's mostly non-authoritative material. And if we were to do that, I would propose we'd also work up the new consequential amendments and amendments to IPSAS 47 that didn't exist when the original document went out, just so we can cover our bases completely with any stakeholders who may wonder how we move from the IPSAS 23 amendments to the 47 amendments, and if we've gone through our appropriate steps on that. So from my perspective, I think we have the staff resources to move that forward, and that would allow us, maybe with a short delay in finalizing leases, to kind of finish it completely, have a nice communication that ties up the entire project and makes it clear that the board started this project but fully completed it. So that would be my proposal.
So, sort of with that in mind, I think maybe if we hold that suggestion for now, Ross, and then kind of walk it through. And in terms of actually walking through the items today, one thing that I suggested from the point of view of a logic flow was that we would move the second paper on IPSAS 47 down to after the paper on IPSAS 23. So just to note that we will not follow exactly the order. So we'll skip over the paper on IPSAS 47, do the ones on effective date and IPSAS 23, and then we'll get to IPSAS 47 at that point. So just to let you know that we haven't missed anything, but it's just from a logic flow that probably makes more sense. So Joao, with that, over to you.
Thank you, Ian, and good morning to the board. So you've already said something that I was about to say. Thank you for that. But there are a few other things that I need to say here. So as you can see, we have quite a busy agenda. The four agenda items are of more of a strategic nature, because it will impact not only what we'll do today, but also what the staff and the task force will do for the March meeting. So the decisions that are taken now will inform the work that we'll do in the first quarter of 2024, and that's why it is really important to address these items. And then the last four items are more of a detailed nature, as Lina said. Staff and task force did a kind of a combo review through all the suggestions, and when we came up with accepting and not accepting, that's why we made those appendices. We appreciate that might be different ways of addressing constituents' suggestions. We have already received some of those suggestions that we are more than happy to take them on board. So this means that there isn't only a one way of doing the things. And so staff is more than happy to receive some of those suggestions even offline and to guide through and easier with this board meeting. Staff also brings for the first time a draft final pronouncement and what it might look like that final pronouncement. But consistent with the recommendations, this means that recommendations is to make amendments to IPSAS 47, so it's no longer reference to IPSAS 23. And also of a more editorial nature of suggestions that we have also received. So we'll not discuss this at the meeting, but it is there for to inform the board where the staff and the task force landed. So it's quite a granular, detailed, I would say sometimes boring type of work, but needs to be done to make it of a high quality. And with this, I don't know if make a pause. Can I continue? Yeah, thank you. So going into lines what Ian, Ross, and Lynn said, we thought that it would be worthwhile to make here kind of a taking of what this project has been over the last 8 years and what and our thinking on how to end this project nicely to our constituents. So, as we all know, this project had an IFRS alignment stage that ended with the publication with IPSAS 43, which basically is an IFRS 16 aligned standard. Type of arrangements were out there and to receive directly from our constituents what they had in terms of the practice, what they had in terms of the standards, to inform our future exposure draft. And with that, we have identified in that RFI 6 type of arrangements. They are there. I'm not going to go through each one of those. And for the first step of the exposure draft, the board at the time decided to publish together with the exposure draft a feedback statement. So our first feedback statement on the trajectory that the board had with this project at that time and what our literature says and what was expected to do going forward. So in a way, we're already setting some expectations to our constituents, of course. But at the time, we should say that we hadn't finalized the revenue standards, the transfer expenses standards. So we were working with the literature that we have, but we knew that we would need, once we finalize this part of the guidance, that we would need to update the revenue standards with these guidance that we were proposing. The revenue transfer expense and eventually also the intangible assets. And that was also basically stated in the feedback statement. And now, as I said earlier, we are bringing a draft final pronouncement of what that would look like. Okay, this was the history. What was the content? So for the first two types of transactions that it was identified in the RFI and from which we also received feedback from, the board is acting upon. So we are basically putting new guidance into the final pronouncement, coming from the expert draft and also to the final pronouncement. And then for the second two types of arrangements, and towards the point that Lynn raised, we added in the final pronouncement some illustrative examples to IPSAS 43 to understand, to help understand the constituents why access rights and arrangements allowing right of use are not leases. And that's where Lynn said that we are struggling because we couldn't go further. We could only conclude that it is not a lease. And that's why we've put in the section of identifying a lease, together with the other 10 examples that IPSAS 43 has, but we couldn't go further because that was not within the scope of what we had for this initial part. But we already saying more than what we are saying in the exposure draft. And for the two remaining arrangements, we also said this at feedback statement. If they are leases and they meet the definition of a lease, the principles that we have in IPSAS 43 perfectly apply to those arrangements. And if those arrangements are not leases, then we would have, this was not stated in the feedback statement, we are only stating our previous literature, IPSAS 23, IPSAS 9, IPSAS 11, but now I'm updating that, hey, we now have new literature, and if it is not a lease, preparers should go to these standards to find the principles. But that's only what they will find. They will find the principles. They will not find non-authoritative guidance related to those principles. And that's where we find that we'll have a gap, missing in our literature. And we thought that for us to finish nicely all these part of the project, the board needs to do something more on this. It's not much, as Ross said earlier, just from our perspective, adding a few illustrative examples on those 4 types of arrangements, put them in the right places of our literature so that we will need to assess. It's a 47, 48, 31. So we don't know yet. So just kind of exploring the possibilities. And with this, we'll cover everything that it was in RFI in a nice way, where it isn't and where it should be, all that guidance related to this type of arrangements that are quite prevalent in the public sector. And with this, I'll make a pause. Ian, I don't know if to receive some feedback from the board.
Yeah, thank you very much, Ray. I mean, I think that shows it's actually been, a very complex journey. And of course, that's only what's happened since we approved leases 2 years ago. There was a long journey before that involving 2 exposure drafts. So I think, given that this was our first request for information, and we did get quite a lot of good input. That proposal from staff does seem quite appropriate. Just sort of, obviously there's some mechanics there involved, but just to check for any comments on the board from the board on that proposal, that we do round off in that way, to make sure that constituents can see that the feedback that they have given has actually been fully addressed within the suite or the landscape of now that we have with those new standards having come in. Todd.
Feels like someone has to say something. I fully support what's being proposed here. I think it will be really helpful for our constituents to close the loop on everything that came through that RFI process. So go for it.
Okay, so thank you for that encouragement, Todd. Lynn.
Yeah, just to be really clear from a board's perspective, the sort of bits in the reddy orange colour at the bottom of the slide is where we're talking about in terms of just doing something extra. That doing something extra does not impact on what we're suggesting in terms of approval of the hot stuff, as it were, the top parts of the slide. So just to be really clear, that's what we're saying.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Lynn. You know, as has been said, this is about tying it all up. It isn't about changing the substantive material that we've got to consider today and the approval process for that. Okay. Oh, Claudia.
I fully support, and I was got to mention that I find it's a very good decision that we use the improvements to IPSAS, not only to bring some improvements from IFRS to in our standards, but to have a housekeeping of our own standing and using really the instrument we have already in a wise way.
Ross.
Yeah, I agree, Claudia. And I think going forward, we're going to do more of this. When we move into next year and hopefully approve what we've proposed in the strategy and work program, I do think we'll have a more active improvements project that will have more IPSAS related improvements. We have used it that way in the past, but we tend to have more things that we need to act on through improvements coming from IFRS because we haven't had an institutional way to develop these minor amendments.
Okay, good. So move us on then, Joao.
Thanks to the board for the show of support. It's really assuring for staff that we are in the right direction to finish this project. So moving now to the specific agenda items. So starting with the first one, the linkages with IPSAS 48. This is basically a pending topic that came from the September meeting. So we had so many, we couldn't address everything at the September. So it's kind of one of the fundamental issues that conceptual issues that it was raised that we couldn't handle at that time, which was basically the issue whether what is the linkage between what we are proposing in concessionary lease accounting to include in IPSAS 43 and the linkages with IPSAS 48, because at the time that we exposed ED 84, there was no IPSAS 48 in place. So it was kind of a sense check that our constituents challenged us to, okay, see what needs to be done without any firmer views, just kind of asking the board to make this sense check before finalization, which is I found really helpful and for us to help us to keep on track on our work. So staff and the task force had a task force meeting in the September meeting to discuss this topic, and we came to a conclusion that IPSAS 48 already explicitly excludes leases. So there is an explicit in a scope section of IPSAS 48. The first one is precise leases. So, and then, okay, already talks about leases, and then we moved, okay, and what about concessionary leases? Well, what we thought, okay, concessionary leases do still meet the definition of a lease because there is still consideration, albeit at below market terms, but there is still consideration. So if there is still consideration, there is still some exchange, a transaction between the parties. So it also meets the definition of a lease, and therefore it is included in the scope exclusion of IPSAS 48. So technically, concessionary leases are then automatically excluded from IPSAS 48. So this was the first conclusion. The second one was about arrangements that convey the right to use an underlying asset for zero consideration, as it is labeled in our exposure draft, right of use assets in kind, where you give right to use, but you don't receive anything in return. So our conclusion was, well, it is outside of the scope of IPSAS 43. They do not meet the definition of a lease because of lack of consideration. So the reverse, the flip side of the coin is, well, if they are not within IPSAS 43, then they would be within IPSAS 48, because they do meet the definition of a transfer expense precisely for the same reason. There is a lack of consideration. So it is kind of giving something without receiving anything in return. And this is where we landed in terms of conclusions. We went a little bit further than this, and we had a kind of a discussion if it would be worthwhile to add in IPSAS 48 in the scope exclusion on leases only, to explicitly scope exclude concessionary leases. And then we concluded no, that similarly to what it was done with financial instruments where it is explicitly scoping out concessionary loans. And we concluded that the analogy doesn't work because the scope exclusion for concessionary loans first refers to financial instruments. And the board wanted to make sure that even concessionary loans are financial instruments, and therefore they are also excluded. In this case of leases, because concessionary leases also meet the definition of a lease, we thought that it would be redundant because it doesn't add more than what it is there. And that's where we say our recommendation would be to proceed with the 84 proposals for concessionary lease for lessors for the final pronouncement, and no changes to IPSAS 48. And with this, I'll open the floor here.
Thank you, João. Any comments on staff proposals? Not seeing any flags raised, so I think the board are content with the proposal.
Thank you. Thank you, the board, for the confirmation. So moving now to the second agenda item, so I ask the board members to go to agenda item 12.2.3, the effective dates agenda item, please. So before jumping into the specific analysis, I just wanted to give this table because we might need to come back and forth during this discussion. So I'm not going to go through all of them, but just to highlight that we have many standards coming over the next years to be effective, 9 standards, more still underway. So it's a huge heavy lifting for our constituents to come to become prepared to implement all these standards. So the effective dates are there, and also the dependencies. So in case there is a need, I'll come back to this. So as we all know, the effective dates are only discussed during the approval process, but staff and the task force thought it would be useful to have this discussion with the board, to have a sense check from the board where the board is on this topic, because it will also help us to do the work for the next quarter. So we are not providing recommendations, we are only providing where we are, and also to receive a similar view from the board where the board is on this topic with some preliminary analysis. So our proposal for the effective date for the final pronouncement is to be effective on January 1st, 2027, for 3 main reasons. So it is broadly consistent with the 3-year application period of IPSAS 43. So this final pronouncement is very much grounded on IPSAS 43. So we thought, if we are giving them already 3 years to implement 43, let's also give them the similar exposure period for to help the preparers getting ready for this new guidance. We thought also that in this way it will not overwhelm preparers because they already have 9 standards. So this would be throwing one more into between those dates. So it will be after, as you are able to see, after the implementation of the other standards. So, and in this way, it will give them 1 more year for planning and implementation after 7 new IPSAs. So, and of course, we will be allowing, as you were able to see in the effective paragraph in the draft final pronouncement, earlier application would be permitted if there are any champions that are really more ready than others. They are able to do that. So staff and the majority of task force proposal would be the January 1st, 2027 for the final pronouncement. So there is another, before passing to the board for discussion, staff thought that it was useful to discuss with the board what we had discussed, which is also the possibility to postpone the effective date of IPSAS 43 to January 1st, 2027, to make it all list related guidance at the same time. And in here, the task force was there was no consensus. So, and what we identified was some arguments for and against that we put forward for the board's consideration and to get also a decision on the effective date of IPSAS 43. So I'm asking basically 2 decisions here from the board. So arguments for the postponing of IPSAS 43 effective date would be prevent reassessing all leases, cost of changes could exceed the benefits, all lease requirements effective at the same time. So this is not an exhaustive list. So this thought that we were kind of more immediate. And for against for each one of those, like always, kind of scales. The scope of IPSAS 13 and IPSAS 43 is the same. So we thought that if they are already applying the guidance to concessionary releases, so the scoping is already the same in terms of the definitions. We also thought that, hey, from lessor accounting, there is no changes. We are only adding some disclosures for the lessor accounting, but the debits and the credits will not change. And we also thought that we are, as we are providing a phased and flexible application of the lease requirements, so first addressing the leases that are under IPSAS 43 and then address concessionary leases, this would be more helpful for constituents. And so the staff and the majority of task force are of the view that no change of the effective date of IPSAS 43 should be made. However, we do have a task force member that recommends the postponement of the effective date of IPSAS 43. So in this case, my suggestion to the board is to have 2 decisions, one on the final pronouncement and the other one on IPSAS 43. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. And I think that's right. So I think if we have the discussion about the effective date of this new guidance on concession releases first, and then we'll consider the discussion that you just outlined on whether there's an argument to defer the effective date of IPSAS 43. So can I have comments on the staff and task force proposal of January 1st, 2027 as the effective date? Yeah, Leanne, start us off.
I support to set the effective date of this proposal, this pronunciation as January the 1st, 2027. But I'm just thinking whether, as it is said, some task force member view is put the whole standard to be effective at the same year. One of my thoughts is such as I'm preparing. If we have different effective day for lease and lease type arrangement. How will I do during the 2 years between the different effective day? I suppose from practical perspective, maybe I will choose to follow the new guidance of the consensual leases, although the mandatory effective day is after 2 years. But maybe from practical perspective, maybe I will choose to follow the same account human as set in the new one. Because from this way, the first, maybe I do not consider to have my own accounting policy in the 2 years between 2025 and 2027, because we can have guidance which I can refer to. And after 2 years, maybe it will be more easier for me to transit to the new one. So I think this may be a practical thought. So if people follow this way, actually in substance, although we will set the effective day of consensual leases after 2 years, but in substance, many people may choose to apply it at the same date as the new lease standard. If people will do this way, actually, I think maybe this is not our intention. So I personally, I will more support to defer the effective day of the holy standard to 2027 for I think maybe there is another reason which I will I will be more supportive, because actually my experience dealing with the lease standard together with private sector entity is actually this standard is very, very troublesome. So actually, people may have to have more work to prepare for the implementation of the lease standard. But even you have more time, maybe you still have to do very detailed work to change your system and to change the internal control and to capture those figures that you can be used to account for the lease transaction. And I think it may be it may make sense if we give 2 more years for them to prepare for the implementation. Maybe one point is not good that as a stand setter, we just issue the lease standard not far away, and we at that time we say the effective date is 2025. But now we change our mind to say that the effective day is 2027. Maybe it is not good, but I think we also have some similar cases from other stand setter, such as IPSASB. Actually, when they issued IFRS 17 insurance contract, actually they said some effective date, but after some time, when they seek for the comments from practice, actually they just change the effective date and defer the effective date and to give people more time to prepare for the implementation. So this may be a case we can refer to because we think about to align the effective date of the lease standard and the new one concession leases, and we also consider the public interest and to give people more time to prepare. So we now to align the effect date and to defer the implementation date for all the guidance. So this is my suggestion. Thank you.
Thanks, Liang. I think a lot to think about and respond to there. I mean, obviously, you've gone into the second point, having supported the 1st of January 2027. And I think one other thing that I would observe, and I'll go to Dave in a minute, is this is an area where we haven't had guidance before. So I think that's something else that needs to be borne in mind. You know, it's not within the existing leasing standard, it's in addition. So and it's new guidance, so just to bear that in mind in the discussion. So Dave, to you, and then to Scott.
So Liang, I think this is a very relevant discussion to have. The one caution I would make is I agree with you completely. I've heard from my experience in the private sector that applying the new leasing standard was challenging. I would just hesitate to consider that as part of this decision because that was considered by the board when IPSAS 43 was approved. So there was a consideration of the challenges and that was thought through. My other view to take in, maybe to push back on that a little, is I don't know whether giving an additional 2 years will allow preparers to, they won't use the entire 4 years. I suspect they'll still wait till the last year or so until they really do their analysis. So I don't know whether it's going to provide them with significant benefit. And then I guess my last point, this goes more into the link with their lease type components. What the task force talked about was they don't think that the concessionary type leases are as heavy a lift, or you don't have to reevaluate all your leases. It should be a subset and hopefully a small subset of your leases, in that in order to have a concessionary lease or another lease type arrangement, you should know from the inception of the lease. So you shouldn't have to go and reevaluate all your leases. You should be able to evaluate fairly quickly which leases are in the scope of the new guidance.
Thanks, Dave. Scott.
Yeah, I think it's kind of hard to talk about these separately, like Leanne did. I'm supportive of the 127 date. I think you've seen all the standards that are walked back from the dates for very intended purposes. I don't disagree, David, the fact that issuers aren't going to do it until it comes up. But the problem is they're identifying transactions, as we saw from the response, that maybe leases, whether they determine it's lease or not, they still have to go through analysis. Okay, and I think they can't understate that. They're going to come up with a lot of decisions that aren't leases, but they have to do the analysis to be able to do that. And so I'm supportive of the 27-day, particularly everything else on the table on that item.
27 to postpone? To postpone then.
Okay. I was trying not to answer the second question, but that would be on the same date for both.
Well, I want to get an answer on the first.
I know, that's why I was not trying to go that way.
So I'm not hearing anybody that is arguing for a different date at the moment. So I just want to check then, are we content that for the new guidance, it is the effective date will be 1st of January 2027? Okay, so I'm seeing nods on that. So I think that is a board decision on that. So then that brings us into the discussion on whether or not to defer the effective date of IPSAS 43 to January 1st, 2027. And I think it hinges in a way on this, to what extent are these integrated or different? Because I think the counter argument to all of this is actually you can early adopt. So, you know, I think it's a moot point, but are we just allowing people to defer what they're going to have to do anyway for 2 years, and at a fairly late stage? So, we'll open for discussion. I think it's clearly there are views backwards and forwards on this. Okay. Andrew.
So I would not be supportive of pushing back the date of IPSAS 43. I think it's an important piece of guidance. It's been out there. We've given it to stakeholders, and I think when we released that as well, it was clear there would be a phase 2, and phase 2 would come later. So I think that message is already out there with our stakeholders. I think if you look at 43 and why these changes are prepared to bring in this debt level, to bring in this message and this communication that is important, I don't see why we should delay this until 2027. I think you do your lease assessment, you go through it. The principles in 43 as to how to determine whether you have a lease or not are in 43. We're not changing those principles in phase 2. We're providing illustrative examples, but we're not changing the principles. They're already there. So I don't see any need to push back 43.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Claudia.
So I'm in favor of postponing the effective date. And one of the arguments which we haven't seen so far is we underestimate the assets, the right of use asset for 2 years. Because when you're following the IPSAS 33 means we are calculating the right of use assets by the actual payments and not of the market rates payments or possible market rates. That means we underestimate the assets. And the argument we could early implement the new standard or the new edition, it's quite weak as we haven't published already the standard. It might be published or agreed next year, and then it's quite a short time for the preparers then to implement them, because it's not only to figure out which contracts are relevant, you need also to modify your system that it calculates right or whatever I expect. So that's why from the public view on, if I'm underestimating assets for 2 years, it's hardly to argument then to the parliamentarian that now I implement a new standard and I have to make an upset to the assets. It seems, that's why I'm really more in favor to postpone it.
So other views and contributions on where members are on this question? Because clearly, we've got a mixture of views expressed. And I think ultimately, probably because we do have a mixture of views, I'm going to ask for a show of hands, but I think it's useful to at least hear where members are at this stage before we actually just do a show of hands on who might be in favour and Lynn.
So I'm in favour for many of the same reasons that Andrew said. So I don't think we should push back the 43 implementation to 2027. At the beginning of this whole agenda item, you talked about this project taking 8 years. It's been out there, people understand. And what we've done in phase 2 is helpful clarifications that one may argue that you could have got there just by looking at 43 in its own right when it comes to concessionary leases. So I'm not of the opinion that we should push that effective date back.
Thank you, Lynn. Adrian.
Well, I would also support not postponing for IPSAS 43. What I think is that working in the public interest does not mean that we would favor preparers' interest first. So I understand the issues that would have to face the preparers going back to the assessment of the leases, but indeed, I believe that, and this is a good argument, that it's been 8 years from now that we're waiting. I mean, the public is waiting for this IPSAS 43. Can't you hear the clamor outside? So, so I think we better keep that effective date 2025. So I would support not postponing.
Okay, thanks, Sergio. Renee?
Yes, thank you. I was also in favor, but after hearing Claudia's comment about this understatement during that transition period, I'm intrigued by that, and you raise an interesting question. I'm just wondering, how is the staff in the task force disposing of that? Like, that's an interesting question to me, and I'd like just more of a conversation on it. Thank you.
Lynn, did you want to come back on that then?
So if it's that significant, there's nothing stopping you early adopting on the phase 2 piece, if you feel that that is significant. And you're analysing your leases in any case to do the 43 implementation. If you've identified that and consider it significant, you can bring forward an early implement phase 2.
Ross, did you want to come in before we go to Todd?
Yeah, maybe just to share one perspective. I take the preparer's pain as a real issue, but I also want to just make the comment that 43 is completely aligned with IFRS 16, which has been out since, I think, 2016 and applicable in the private sector since January 1st, 2019. And our standard's been out there for a couple of years now, too. So there is a building practice on some of these application issues, and there is a ton of guidance that the firms and others have put out there to help with application of the basic leasing model. And I do think there's a model with sticking to the guns on the original date, letting people figure out the new lease accounting model, and then having some time to do the concessionary leases separately. Yeah, there's a transition period, but that's what we do hear from constituents is, give us time over time to do things. And I don't think pushing back that date really helps, other than Dave's point, just giving more time to defer actually digging into the hard issues.
Thank you, Ross. So I'll go to Todd. Liang, I know you want to come back in. I'm just taking a first round of comments. So I will go to Nima after Todd.
Thanks, Ian. I think on this question, I'm sort of in two minds, really. And why am I in two minds? I know in my own jurisdiction, they don't want to do anything until all of the proposals are on the table and deal with them all at once. The current setup may not allow, just because of the time it can take people to put them into effect, may not allow them to do it all at once. So people might be on a path with the current 43 to get things in for the 1 January 2025. But once this sort of gets out, they may not feel like they've got the time to be able to do this at the same time. And that could be a bit of a problem in my mind, I suppose. For those that don't want the hassle of having to reassess things, a year or two later. So that's sort of one thing going on in my mind. But, the other side of it is, as people have said, we've got it out there. There's a history with the IPSASB, so what's really new? So if you do go to a vote, it's going to be quite difficult for me because I am in sort of two minds on this. I can see the arguments both ways. And, our own experience in New Zealand, not going to do anything until we can see everything and do it once and do it properly. So that's my perspective at this point.
Thanks, Todd. Nima.
Thank you, Ian. Actually, from what Ross was saying, that it is fairly the same as IFRS 16. In our jurisdiction, we've already implemented the 43. So we're thinking of if we postponed it, then probably it will be a problem. So I'm of the opinion of not postponing it, mainly because of the fact that we've already started the implementation. Thank you.
Thank you, Nima. Abdullah.
Thank you, Chair. And for me,
I'm not with delaying anything. There has been a communication out there. We said when we approved 43 that we would be keeping an eye on the revenue standard, and we reassessed that, and we thought it was 25 would give an amount of time for jurisdictions to do the assessment and do the work for adopting 43. And in reality, all the cases that or the issues that we covered in the ED, most of them were not in the scope of 43, except for just two issues, I guess. But all the other items or the other issues that were brought by jurisdictions were not in the scope of 43. And what we did was just lots of description, clarification, and adding some items to clarify that. And from my own perspective, if you delay it, that means everything is going to be delayed until for 26 for people to start working on it. But if you do it now, everybody will just analyze their contracts, and the piece that is related to these other arrangements will come along after they do it, and there is a maturity journey they have to take. And for me as an implementer, I will start on it from today. The second argument, it is in alignment with IFRS 16. Most of the concepts are not different from IPSAS 13. So for me, it would be an encouragement for jurisdictions to adopt it, to have an early adoption. The third element of discussion, we will have effective day of 25, but still there is a jurisdiction option. Todd was saying they can delay it, but for us, it's at 25. We will keep it, and that is our communication.
Thank you, Abdullah. So I know Liang and Claudia want to come in with second comments, but I just want to check whether there are any other members who want to come in terms of first round of comments. Okay, so what I think we'll do is I'll take second round of comments from Liang and Claudia, and then I think at that stage I will ask for a vote, and I think we need to see where things land at that stage. João, anything you want
Yes,
to?
thanks for all this discussion, and staff really appreciates the different perspectives. We thought a lot about this, and in the end, what we concluded is that, and distilling in a single idea, there is nothing broken in IPSAS 43 that leads us, a standard setter, to postpone the effective date. So from a standard setting perspective, not having anything broken there that we'll need to put postpone the date leads us to conclude that our recommendation of not postponing. And I just want to throw this idea to the board, because this is not in the papers, for the board to reflect before voting. Thank you.
Thank you, João. So go to Liang and then Claudia, and then we will take a vote.
Thanks, Chair. I just thought about as I just point out, some people may choose to early adopt the new guidance as of consensual lease. But after I hear what Claudia said, I think this is also likely that people may choose that not follow the new guidance of consensual leases between the year of the 2025 and 27. So it is very possible that when people, when the users to look at different sets of financial statement, he will find the financial information of essentially leases are quite not comparable between 2025 and 2027 because people may choose different ways to account for it during these 2 years. So I think this may be one problem. Another problem just in my mind is actually if we look at the effect date of ISB standard on revenue and leases, actually the effective date of revenue IFRS 15 is before the effective date of the lease standard IFRS 16. I don't mean that we should follow what ISB has done, but one observation from me is actually to put lease asset on balance sheet. Actually, it is a new matter for the lessees, and actually, people may not expect. My experience when dealing with lease accounting with private sector entities, many matters, many issues, you are not expect before you implement hand by hand. So I'm not sure whether there may be new matters if the effective date of lease standard come before the revenue standard, whether there will have more new matters that public sector entity should deal with, because we may have no experience from private sector entities, because no one has done this. So at this moment, I'm not sure whether there will be more and more new matters that we have to deal with when we to have lease standard first, then we have revenue standard afterwards. And understand that people will say we have waited for so many years, 8 years or around that for this lease standard. But actually, from my point of view, you have wait for 8 years, maybe wait for another 2 years are not so long compared to 8 years. So from this point of view, actually, I think maybe to defer 2 more years and to have the whole guidance related to leases maybe more makes sense for us and for public interest. Thank you.
Thanks, Yang. I just wonder if staff could remind us, because I think we must have had this discussion around the fact that the effective date for IPSAS 47 is later than the effective date for leases, and I'm assuming that that was because of the ability to early implement. Is that right?
Yes, that reason, and also because we solved also this problem when approving IPSAS 43, because in IPSAS 43 we have explicit cross-reference to the international standard on revenue in the absence of IPSAS 47. So, and we also have a BC explaining that the principles that are in IPSAS 43 that need guidance from IPSAS, the future IPSAS on 47, can be brought from IFRS 15, and that is explicitly stated in the in IPSAS 43. And when IPSAS 47 was published, we just replaced those references to IPSAS 47. So there is no problem in transition, because that it's not expected to have any changes in the accounting because of that.
Okay, thank you, Joel. That's very helpful. Lynn, were you also on that point, or no? Okay, so if I go to Claudia and then to Lynn, which I think is appropriate to wrap up as task force chair before we move to a vote.
Thank you. I just wanted to know, postponing could mean that these countries or these entities which would like to early adopt, we could permit them that they can still like Tanzania have already done their job quite well, allow them to implement as originally proposed, that they can start with 2025, and they believe it's in their best interest. But for these entities which have like more the one package approach, they can choose then this the postpone date. So that means I want to make just clear, postponing doesn't mean that they are not allowed, in my view, to earlier permit adoption of the IPSAS 33.
Thanks, Claudia. Lynn, to you, and then I will move us to a vote.
Yeah, the observation that I don't think has come out in the discussion that I just wanted to make was if you postpone 43 implementation where you have got genuine leases, you are still not recognising a right of use asset on the statement of financial position and your balance sheet. And so, and we have agreed that it is better accounting to recognise right of use assets on the balance sheet. And to my mind, there is a public interest argument that proceeds with that, and we shouldn't lose sight of that part where it's genuine leases, not concession releases. If you postpone, you continue not to recognise those right of use assets on the balance sheet. So I think we ought to remind ourselves of that in taking the decision as well.
So thank you very much, Lynn. Thank you very much, everyone. I think that this is a tricky issue. And I think that's actually been a very good discussion, and thank you to everyone that's been contributed. I think a lot of good argument and good thought has gone in terms of both sides of what is a very tricky issue. So in terms of just asking for a vote on this, I think probably the way we need to do it is that the recommendation in the staff paper is not to defer the effective date. And so I think, you know, in voting, Ross will ask us to vote in the normal way. So for, against, abstain. So if you're voting for, you are voting for maintaining the current effective date of IPSAS 43. If you vote against, that is, you know, to defer to the same date as the concession releases. Is that clear? Right, Ross, take us through the process then.
Thanks, Ian. So first, I'll ask members in the room and online, if you're available, Kamira, to please raise your hands if you vote for the staff recommendation, which is maintaining the current effective date. Those voting for, please raise your flags. So we have 14 for, that's 13 flags in the room, and Kamira's flag is raised online. So 14 votes for maintaining the current effective date. Just to complete the purposes, I'm going to ask now those who are voting against to please raise your flags. I have 1, 2, 3 flags up in the room. So voting against. And now I'll ask for any abstentions to please raise their flag. And we have 1 abstention, Todd's abstaining. So we'll note that for the record. Thank you for the decision.
Okay. And that is the majority from the board. So thank you very much, everyone. I think it is a tricky decision, but thank you very much for the discussion that we've had. What I'm going to suggest is, obviously we've got quite a lot more material to cover, but I think that's probably a good point to take our break. So we will break for 20 minutes and back at 10:02, please. Okay, so having had the discussion about the effective date, we'll now move then into the sort of some of the flow-ons from that. In terms of timings from here on in, we're at the sort of stage in the meeting where I don't want to curtail the debate that we're having on leases, and we need to make sure we've got time for that. So we've got some flex in terms of the timing of the lunch break and so on. So we will sort of manage as depending on how we get through the material. But I do want to make sure we've got time for the discussions, and I think we have at the moment. It's just a question of how quickly we move through things. So watch the space. João, to you.
Thanks, Ian. So now we are in the fourth agenda item, so 12.2.4. I ask the board to go to that papers. So this is what staff usually says, those idiosyncrasies of standard setting, where not everything is perfectly aligned with the several projects that staff has running and with this board for publications. So at the time that ED 84 was issued, it was proposed amendments to IPSAS 23 because that was the standard that that it was effective at that time. So this means that ED 84 was issued before even the publication of IPSAS 47, which supersedes 23. And we all know, as we saw earlier on, that IPSAS 47 effective date is January 1st, 2026. So, and IPSAS 47 supersedes 23. So this means that for this project, for this final pronouncement, and taking into consideration that the board show of hands was that to have an effective date of 2027, IPSAS 23 will no longer be effective. I would say even will no longer exist because it will be taken out of the IPSASB handbook because it will be with IPSAS 47. So for us, staff and task force didn't make much sense to propose amendments to a standard with an effective date of those amendments beyond the effective date of the whole standard. So. And of course, for those entities that want to early apply, it was discussed earlier, as we see in the next agenda item, if they do apply IPSAS 47, they can early apply also these amendments. So that would be part of the flexibility that the final pronouncement will allow. And with this, where staff and the task force have as a recommendation would be not to include the amendments to IPSAS 23 in the final pronouncement. And with this, I'll open the floor for discussion, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, João. It shows the difficult geography that we're coping with at the moment. So any comments on that recommendation from staff? Okay, so I think we're content with that.
Okay, thanks for the confirmation. So now moving to agenda item number 2, please, you need to go back in the papers, which is about the inclusion then of amendments to IPSAS 47 in the place of IPSAS 23 in the final pronouncement. Here, I just want to do kind of a heads up of this agenda item, so we'll have the analysis and the consequent recommendation. But after this, I will also speak a little bit of what it is in issues papers, but there is no recommendation, but it is essential for the discussion of the whole document. So IPSAS 47 presents a new accounting model, as we all know, for revenue in the public sector that differs from IPSAS 23. But when we look at the precise guidance that it was in IPSAS 23, that it was proposed for concessionary leases, and when we adapted that guidance to IPSAS 47 principles, after doing the work, we came to the conclusion that the guidance doesn't substantially change. Actually, as you are able to see in the appendix to the agenda item, it's basically copy-paste of the guidance with minor terminology changes to update to the newly specific terminology that we have in IPSAS 47 about compliance obligations, and before we had conditions, so it's very minor. So what does this mean? It means that also there is no change in the accounting outcomes, and all this guidance, all this work was already done with this board on concessionary loans that existed in IPSAS 23, that moves also to IPSAS 47, and we made sure that we did the same exercise and consistency. Because of this, our recommendation, so in this case, would be to include in the final pronouncement the amendments to IPSAS 47 drawn from EDA 84 proposed amendments in the final pronouncement. So this is the recommendation that it is in papers, and from which we want to seek the board's view on this recommendation. Another topic that it is in the papers, but it is not a recommendation yet, because normally we only talk about the topic after the approval, which is whether there is a need or not for re-exposure. And we also, given the discussion that we already heard earlier today about the gaps that we have in our literature, what we thought is, if we look into the specific guidance that it was proposed and what we have in the due process, there are two conditions for re-exposure of those amendments. And it is basically, I would loosely say, a substance over form approach that we have, which is if there are any substantial changes to the proposals that were not that the constituents did not have the opportunity to comment, and of course, if there was substantial change to the substance of a proposed international standard. And our view is that these two conditions are not met for re-exposure. But this is a kind of a narrow approach, or to say formalistic approach. But given the context of where we are in, that we discussed earlier about the overview of the whole project and the whole literature that it is still missing to address completely what we put kind of in expectations to our constituents, we thought that there may be benefit to exposure not only those new non-authoritative guidance, illustrative examples, in implementation guidance, together with the new authoritative guidance to IPSAS 47, just for constituents to be able to see everything together. And in this case, it is no longer kind of labeled as a re-exposure, because we are exposing everything as a package for the constituents to be able to see how the principles match with the illustrative examples. And in that process, so I would then finish here. So my presentation, and open the floor.
So Ross, can I pass over to you just to sort of clarify how that fits with the approach you proposed earlier?
Yeah, I would say that analysis is slightly different from what I'm proposing. Is, re-exposure in our due process is a very specific item that comes after you approve a standard. So you have to have a new approved standard before you can actually decide whether they have a vote on re-exposure. How Joao's explained, the principles do drive your re-exposure considerations. I would say if we go with my proposal from the beginning of the meeting, that we do a limited exposure on a limited scope ED with the amendments coming from the RFI to other standards. And we include the amendments from IPSAS 47 because technically they weren't exposed. That's not re-exposure. That's just a limited scope exposure draft. The board would decide to take that forward. Staff would develop it. They would approve it as an exposure draft. So the word re-exposure should never appear in any of that, board papers or approvals from our perspective. I think that's a cleaner way to do this because technically, I think if we were to go the re-exposure route, then questions whether you're re-exposing everything, and we're talking about some very consequential minor amendments that are consistent with something that's been exposed. And I agree that doesn't meet the conditions for re-exposure. But if we are doing this other ED, I think it makes sense to just throw those in, give people a chance to comment.
So just to summarize, then as it stands at the moment, although they're not, the proposed amendments to 47 are not substantively different, and this is a due process point of view, perspective, it's nothing more than that. As you can see from that appendix that Joel's given us, what we would be doing is doing a very limited short exposure, just so that from a due process point of view, those formal amendments to 47, which have not been exposed before, are then exposed, but they're also exposed alongside the proposed additional guidance, which would then wrap the project up. So that this would be, a neat separate package that allows us to round the project off. And in terms of the approach to approval of the rest of the document here, that would still go ahead as proposed in March, just subject to any final amendments that came out of that limited exposure. So the whole thing would effectively be wrapped up in June. Is that clear for people? Claudia?
Still, could you explain again when you plan to expose this small package and on how much time they have to react, our stakeholders, that we can get the final vote on the whole package of the new standard in June, or as far as I understood?
So I think this limited scope ED that we're talking about, we'd prepare now and bring to the March meeting for approval. We'd expose it similar to improvements on a 60-day exposure, and that's within due process. I still think, and to talk to Lynn about this, I think she was in agreement that we would look for approval in principle of all of the changes related to leases, subject to any significant issues coming back from the limited scope.
So that approval would be in March.
In March as well.
As currently scheduled. Andrew.
So happy with the exposure on the illustrative examples that are coming from the RFI to say we're going to put these in other standards, these are not leases, etc. I'm not entirely comfortable with including the 47 amendments in that. I think the 47 amendments were part of principles therein, were part of the ED when that went out for exposure. Those principles have been there. How do you account for right of use assets in kind, for example, how that goes through? And I think it's more of an integral part of this package of phase 2. So to put that out to an exposure again, whether we get technical re-exposure or not, to me, it's a re-exposure of the principles. I think it would confuse constituents. I don't know if we're going to learn anything more, but I think it also puts us at risk that there's potentially something that comes back that we then reopen at phase 2. And I think we've been through the exposure process. People have had a chance to comment on that. So I wouldn't be supportive of putting the 47 amendments into the exposure draft.
I think we're exposed either way on this. If you look at our due process, we need to expose amendments to standards before those are made. And if you look at the situation as it stands at the moment, I agree and you can see that substantively they are consistent with what's already been exposed as changes to 23, but they have not been exposed as changes to 47. And we have had this on one or two occasions where, you know, it's actually just being seen to have gone through the hoops. And we know that there are a number of constituents out there that are not supportive of the direction that we are going in. And so what this is proposing is not to delay finalisation, it's actually just proposing to make sure that there is no reason on due process grounds that the final guidance can be challenged. So, you know, I agree with you, there is a risk that somebody comes back with something, but essentially, if they come back with the same argument they've already come back with, we just say, well, we've already looked at that argument and we don't accept that. So I think there is a risk, you're right, but actually I would argue from a stakeholder perception point of view, there's a greater risk to not going through this process and just going through the formality of including the 47 proposed 47 amendments. And from a point of view of stakeholder handling, and this is, you know, I think really important as we discussed at the beginning, actually we probably should put out those final changes to include the examples in 47, so we've not lost anything. I don't think we're going to be exposed to a major risk through this, but it does actually seal off potential avenue for challenge in the future. Scott.
Yeah, I just want to support your comment. I think what's at risk is due process and this whole thing, as you said at the very beginning. And the amendments were not exposed in 47. So it's pretty simple that we can expose them. If we get the same arguments back, we've already dealt with them, just like any other exposure we've done.
Claudia.
I can follow this due process strategy that we need to expose this. But what I don't understand, how we can in March approve the standard if then this part isn't in this standard, so we have then a second approval on the exposure draft. It's not really technical clear how the due process is working on, because then I can't approve in March on the amendments to IPSAS 47 when we have the exposure draft still open.
Ross.
So on that, I think if the board agrees to this approach, I think let us go away and work up a full set of papers to make it clear in March exactly what you're approving and how it's going to work. And we'll be crystal clear before the board's in an approval situation on what they're approving, what it's subject to, and what's coming back in June. It is complicated, and I don't want to make it sound less complicated than it is, and I don't want to overpromise. I can tell you we'll be crystal clear with what you're approving in March, what's in there, and you know, whatever the board decides, we'll put in the ED and we'll put appropriate explanatory language so people understand the nature of it and why we're doing it.
Okay. So I think with that, we go into the discussion of the inclusion of the IPSAS 47 amendment, and then we'll proceed through the remainder of the finalisation papers. The staff will come back with those clear proposals in terms of what's the package that the board is voting on in March, and how does that interrelate with that separate exposure draft. But it is an exposure draft, it's not re-exposure. Okay, apologies for the complexity on that, but it is a very difficult landscape that we're working with at the moment. João, take us back into then. So I think with that, the question is, do we include the amendments to IPSAS 47? Are the board content that those should be included? And that's basically subject to anything that we might hear on that exposure. Okay, so I'm taking that as agreement. Okay, move us forward then, Joel.
Thanks the board for those two decisions. This will help a lot staff and the task force for the March meeting. So thank you for that decisions. So now moving to the agenda item number 5. Now we are in the normal order of the papers. So the next 3 agenda items, they have the same structure to help the board understand the work that staff and the task force did. As you could see, there are many suggestions, very detailed, sometimes of drafting nature. We tried to categorize these into types of suggestions. The ones that we thought that we could accept them, and we actioned that in the draft ED that it is in the appendix, and the ones that we thought for the reasons that are in the papers not to accept. So what I ask from the board is not to go one by one. It's very detailed, it's very lengthy. What I ask is on an exception basis, if there are any fundamental reasons to go in a different way. And if even doing that, it's very difficult to explain or to go through with this board, staff and the task force is more than happy to have offline meetings with the respective board members. And also because we acknowledge that there might be different ways of addressing the same suggestions. So it's not closed what we are recommending, but we don't want also to take board time, plenary time, to go with very granular and detailed analysis. So my recommendation to this board is on the appendix number A1, if they are in agreement with the acceptance that the staff did. And before opening the board, there are still 2 pending items that are in those tables. It were perfectly identified. So we are not expecting to have that discussion now, if there are any, but we'll bring those for the March meeting. And some of those items are pending with the measurement, so those are perfectly identified. I just want to get feedback from the others. So on the first appendix, on the acceptance, and then we can go for the non-acceptance. And with this, I'll open the floor to you again.
Okay, so on this is Appendix A1 on page 20. Are there any comments from the board on that appendix? Okay, so I think we're content with that. So then are there any comments on Appendix A2, which is page 21 of 35? Okay. So I think we're good with those.
Thank you for the confirmation. So moving to the next agenda item on for lessees. So I'll not spend further, just open the floor then to have the same approach, Ian. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. So here we're on Appendix A1 to 12.2.6, which is page 23 of 35. Are there any comments on those proposals there? Okay, so I think we're fine with those. Sorry, those go over the page, don't they? Apologies. So are there any comments on page 24 of 35? Okay. So then we're on A2, which is on page First page is 25 of 35. Second page is 26 of 35. Third page is 27 of 35. '28 of 35. 29 of 35. Okay, so we're in agreement with the proposals there in item 12.2.6. So move us on then, Joel.
Yeah, thanks for the confirmation. So now moving to the last one on these topics. So we isolated the right of the use assets in kind. So it is the same approach with a similar format in terms of appendices, and I'll open the floor to receive the board's feedback on those appendices, Ian.
Okay, so we're first on Appendix A1, which is on page 31 of 35. Any comments on that? And then any comments on page 32 of 35, that's Appendix A2. Okay, so I think we're fine with those. So then that takes us on to basis for conclusions. Sure.
Thanks once again for the confirmation. It's really helpful. So now for the last agenda item, it's about the draft basis for conclusions. And here, because staff and task force are bringing for the first time the draft ED, we thought that it would be helpful to get a first sense also from the board on how these BCs will look like. So just kind of highlight as it is in the papers. So these BCs are not final, they are not complete, they are not exhaustive. So it's just to get but we wanted to add much more than what we had before without already on how we are planning to write these BCs in answering some of the comments from constituents, but it's not yet complete. So there are many more that we're going to have to add. So what we wanted to get from the board is about the structure and the sequencing of these BCs. And also about which have basically two parts. BCs related to part to IPSAS 43, and the second part related to IPSAS 47. The replacement of amendments to IPSAS 23 with amendments to IPSAS 47, because there are many cross references that will need to be updated in the BCs, but also in the core standards. So just kind of having that comfort that we have from confirmation from the board to have IPSAS 47, and also the level of detail. As you could see, we have many, but many of those we thought that don't have the, how do you say, the importance to be in the BCs, and perhaps what we'll do is we'll aggregate them, but we want to highlight what are the most important issues that related to the principles or additional guidance that was asked that the board considered. So it's this high-level approach, and to receive any feedback, suggestions on how to do the BCs, and that is all for now. Staff, just to make clear, is not looking to receive feedback on the exact draft that it is there. Staff is more than happy to receive offline on what it is there, if there are already any drafting suggestions, editorials. But what we want is just to get the overview if the board is happy with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. So I'm going to suggest that we just do what we've done at other points in the board meeting, and we'll just walk through page by page. And this is item 12.3.1. And I think we're starting on page 12 of that. So literally just want to walk through page by page and get any particular high level comments or concerns that board members have. So Ross will just lead us through that as we've done before.
Yes, so as Ian said, this is page 12 of the item. And you can see the new text and markup. And the first BC is BC 105 and the introduction. So any comments on the revised BCs related to introduction? Not seeing any comments. So the next replacement of amendments to 23 with amendments to 47. Definitions on page 13. Moving to 14. Responses to ED 84 concessionary leases, right of use assets in kind. (16) (17) reassessment of the lease liability. Lease modifications. Lessee, moving to the bottom of page 17. Page 18. (19) we have amendments halfway down 19, responses to ED 84 concessionary leases and right of use assets in kind. Into page 20. Page 21. Page 22. Halfway down, we have some amendments again related to ED 84, BC 174 and 175. Moving through to page 23. Page 24. More amendments on responses to ED 84. Ordered way down the page. 25. (26) That brings us to the end of the BCs.
Okay, thank you for that. And so as João has said, there will be a number of amendments that will come through as a result of the various different changes. And I think there's possibly also a need just to look at the language around it. They're quite terse at the moment. And I think from a stakeholder point of view, we perhaps need to just be a bit more rounded in terms of how some of those are phrased. So if we can make that request just to have a bit of a look at that. Other than that, João, is there anything else that you need? I mean, I think we should record our thanks to João and to the task force members. This is a really complex and tricky project technically, and also sitting it in with our existing literature. And I think, the task force has really helped a lot. There's a lot of material here, as I think Lynn said in her introduction. So, thank you as well for the task force just to bear with us for that, in the push through to March. That will, I think, it's been a long journey, and almost this final bit is the hard bit, is to keep going and make sure we wrap it up fine. But I think we've got a way forward on that, complex though this remains. So With that, that brings the other lease type arrangements to a close. And then I think what we're going to do is we will move now into Ross's Programme and Technical Director's report. And then we will bring the formal meeting to a close at that point in time before we have the farewell to departing members.
Thanks. So I think board has made this summary today of meeting progress quite easy because we've made lots of decisions and moved a lot of things forward as planned. So I'll just do a quick update of where we stand. I did just want to first highlight, 3 approvals we had. And I think just good job to everybody. I think it's great to get IPSAS 33 formally moved into a project and get that moving. It's also great to get the exposure drafts approved on ED 86 and 87 and actually out for exposure in early January. So, thanks to everybody for helping move those along. It's always nice to have some approvals and some progress at each meeting. We do have a couple of updates to the work program that were agreed in the various sessions. So natural resources, it became clear after good progress that March might not be attainable and we'll probably need 3 more months. So that's been adjusted to June 2024. And measurement application phase, I think also it's clear that the board not having seen a full ED yet is probably going to need at least 1 more meeting to get through that. Not on here because it was just agreed was the slight change to the forward trajectory of leases with the narrow scope amendment ED that we're going to be updating for as well. So you'll see that shown on the work program and you'll see both those items back in March. So with that brings us to a close to dates to the work program and items that will be reflected on the work program. And just
thanks, Ross. So if I can just check if there are any comments members want to make on those updates that Ross has proposed. Good. Okay. Well, thanks for that. I think that slight amount of extra time on those projects will actually land them in a much better state, and also give us as a board time to make sure that we do actually talk through all the various different aspects. So I think with that, that brings us to the formal conclusion of the meeting. I just want to say thank you very much to the board and to, for some very good discussions, I think, and I think all of the board have been able to participate in that, which is tremendous. I think we've had some very good breakouts, which have enabled the TAs and observers to contribute directly. And I think we've had some great direction from those discussions on both the climate-related disclosures and also on presentation of financial statements. To thanks everyone for that. And of course, we couldn't do this without the staff in terms of all of the papers that they provided us with. But last but not by no means least, Leah and the AV team and the staff at CPA who've actually supported us in terms of all the stuff. And it's a huge amount of stuff that goes on underneath the surface. We're just the swan gliding across the top. It's all of the frantic paddling underneath that goes on. So thank you very much, everyone, for that. And also thank you to our colleagues at IPSASB, I think, as well, in terms of last night's event. So with that brings us to the formal end of the meeting. And as ever, unfortunately, December means that we have to say farewell to two board members. And this time round, it is Nima and Todd. So if the two